Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is July the 16th, 2026. Today I want to discuss the American Colonization Society, which was founded on December the 21st, 1816. This was during the presidency of James Madison, our fourth president. However, while James Madison was heavily involved uh, in the American Colonization Society, as was Thomas Jefferson and President James Monroe, it was actually a private organization. The American Colonization Society was a private organization, not a government agency, but they would receive a lot of support amongst prominent government officials, including presidents, as I just mentioned them, and also they received financial support. The purpose of the American Colonization Society was to resettle emancipated emancipated African Americans, to resettle them back in Africa, right, in their own colony. Now, of course, our early some of our early presidents, like Thomas Jefferson, did not believe, that freed slaves could live successfully amongst white Americans, and there was a concern of freeing them en masse. Of course, by the time of the Revolution, there were half a million. That's the Revolution in 1776. There were approximately half a million um, black people, right? Over 90% of them were enslaved in America. Of course, today, black people are about 40 million in America, roughly 13% of the US population. That's it today in 2026. So there was a concern by you know, uh, many former presidents, including Thomas Jefferson, who was himself a slave owner. And although he expressed that he expressed his hatred of the institution of slavery, but no doubt, but with that, regardless, he was a slave owner himself. But he thought one day, even though slavery would end one day, but he didn't see. He thought it would create a social upheaval if blacks and whites were to live together in America, and so he had the idea, amongst other presidents, that emancipated blacks should be resettled, right, in a colony established for them, either in Africa, also, somewhere that was popular was in Haiti, because Haiti was already an established, already had a black republic in the Western Hemisphere after their successful slave rebellion, right, which kicked out the French. Um, in fact, President Ulysses Grant, who was our 18th president, and of course who won the Civil War against the Confederates, he had submitted a proposal to Congress which failed, to annex Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo today is the Dominican Republic. It was the Spanish side of the peninsula, right, which was Saint Domingue, was colonized by the French. Saint Domingue, which came to be known as Haiti, right, was colonized by the French, and then the Spanish side was Santo Domingo, which today is known as Dominican Republic. So Ulysses Grant thought that blacks, it wasn't out of racism, but it was out of being practical. He was a general, he was a president who went against the Ku Klux Klan. So after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan, of course, came about, and they were terrorizing blacks in the South. And of course, President Grant actually established the Department of Justice and other provisions to to basically crush the destroy the Ku Klux Klan. So he realized that blacks wouldn't be able to achieve their full rights as citizens, because the 14th Amendment had passed, right, which was saying black Americans were equal to whites, right? They had equal protection of the law, due process of the law. They were citizens, equal citizens, and America didn't create a two-tier citizenship, right? So they were supposed to be equal citizens. So he decided he wanted that he wanted um, uh, a colony or somewhere in the territory to be annexed by the United States in the Caribbean, right? And in this case, it was Santo Domingo. He wanted the U.S. government to annex it, and eventually that it would be able to achieve statehood. Um, Although the reasons he gave in Congress were for to advance commerce and to also advance the Monroe Doctrine and to establish for naval for the U.S. military and naval uh, power, right? In his personal memoirs, and I read it, in his personal memoirs, it was to address the discrimination against blacks in the South and to create a safe haven, a safety valve or sanctuary for black Americans to be able to achieve, independence, self-governance, and to be able to prosper on their own without the antagonism and the discrimination and the hostility of the majority whites in the South. It failed, but it had support amongst Black Americans. Frederick Douglass supported it, and the first Black senator, Hiram Revels, right, supported it. They wanted it, but unfortunately, it failed. In fact, the prominent abolitionist and Senator Charles Sumner, who was a prominent abolitionist, was one of the people who struck it down, ensured it failed because he thought it represented unnecessary American imperialism, which he was against, and he thought it would create a second-tier class of of Black Americans, of colored Black Americans, right? So I guess to him, the idea of blacks being equal was to be integrated, right, and not to create a separate parallel society, which basically was what came down to us in Brown versus Board, because they attempted segregation, a parallel society in the South, but it only meant less resources were passed down to blacks, and of course Brown versus Board established that separate was not equal, and this didn't come until 1954. But so back to the attempts of the U.S. government to establish a separate colony for freed Black Americans, and that was with the establishment of American Colonization Society. Again, it was a private organization. It was, it had the support, the patronage of wealthy Americans, right? Wealthy Americans and industrialists, philanthropists, clergymen like Reverend Robert Finley, who was a Presbyterian minister, and prominent Americans. Henry Clay, congressman who went on to become a senator in President John Quincy Adams' administration, was one of the champions of the American Colonization Society and a member. The first president was Bushrod Washington, who was actually a nephew of President George Washington. So Bushrod Washington was its first president. So it ended up failing. By the way, the plans to repatriate, resettle freed slaves, all of America's freed slaves, majority to either the Caribbeans or in Africa, ultimately failed because Black Americans, the majority, almost all Black Americans, did not want to resettle. But between 1820 and 1843, thereabouts, roughly 12 to 15,000 freed African Americans, emigrated to Liberia with the help of the American Colonization Society. So the capital came to be known as Monroeville, after President James Monroe. They received funding. They received funding from some support from the U.S. government, right? And I'll get to that. But the issue of reparations, I guess someday I'm going to have a discussion about reparations. Um, on Sundays, I talk about, I dig into scripture, right, to look for wisdom, right, in the scriptures. And interestingly, if we consider another group of people, another nationality that was mass enslaved, right, for a long time, for about 400 years, roughly the time black Americans were enslaved as well. That's the Jewish people in the Bible, right? The Hebrews in the Bible in Egypt. Now, when they were finally freed and they were going to leave, they didn't settle in Egypt, right? They didn't live amongst their hosts. They decided to go back to where they came from, to the land of Canaan, right? Right. In But they got reparations, right? They got reparations. If you read the book of Exodus, chapter 12, 35, 36, you see it says that the children of Israel did according to what Moses instructed them, and they asked the Egyptians, yeah, right, their former slave masters and hosts, they asked them for gifts, right? And the Egyptians, God caused the children of Israel to find favor with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians gave them jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and raiment, right? Raiment, that means garments, right? Luxurious garments. So they gave them substantial wealth, and it says that the children of Israel spoiled the Egyptians, right? That means they plundered them, right, as they were leaving Egypt. So basically, they were paid reparations, right? So they were paid reparations. But that's a discussion for another time. I'll do a discussion on reparations. Now, back to the American Colonization Society. It was a private organization, and they got funding from private wealthy Americans, right? And the church. But the United States government did support them. In 1819, Congress appropriated $100,000, right, for their support to resettle help resettle freed black Americans in Liberia, right? So that was in 1819, right? $100,000 in 1819. In today's money, that's roughly $2.6 million, right? 2,600,000, over $2,600,000. And during the Civil War, right? Abraham Lincoln had considered that as well, right? That, if blacks wanted to, after they were freed, they were emancipated, that maybe they would want to resettle somewhere else, right? There was something called the DC Emancipation Act, in which about $600,000 was appropriated, allowing the newly freed black Americans in DC to emigrate, right, to voluntarily emigrate, but they refused, right? They refused to. So $600,000 was appropriated by President Abraham Lincoln. $600,000 in today's money, that's roughly $20 million, right, in today's money, 2026. But a lot of that money went unused. It was diverted because the vast majority, almost all black Americans who'd been freed, refused to leave America. They didn't want to go and resettle anywhere. And there was reason for it. There's justification. They just wanted to live in America, try and create lives for themselves, look for lost family here in America, and try and work. That was what majority of black Americans decided after they had been freed. They didn't want to go back to Africa, right? So, and there were, but between 1820 and 1843, roughly 15,000, right? About 15,000 formerly enslaved black Americans were resettled in Africa, in Liberia, right? But only 40% of them survived. Over 60% of them died due to malaria, right? Due to disease, malaria, or due to tribal conflict. They're killed due to tribal conflict, because You see, the lands that they went to, belonged. There were people living there already. There were different tribes, African tribes living there. Now, Liberia is on the coast of West Africa. So how did the American Colonization Society get the lands, right? So they acquired the lands through force, right? They coerced some African tribal chiefs in the area of Liberia to give up their lands by giving them, they deceived them, gave them rum, right, alcohol, weapons, gunpowder, and some muskets. Gave them some of these things, and those African kings, right, didn't realize that they were permanently ceding their sovereign control, right? They thought, it was just maybe they were just guests, they were going to leave. And so this created a conflict, right? It created an issue. It was an issue much later on. And of course, the United States government, the military, was also supporting the American Colonization Society. So they backed them up with gunboat diplomacy. So U.S. Navy vessels, right, would just, were there threatening, they were docked pretty close, just threatening the African kings in Liberia, that if they didn't play ball, right, if they didn't cede this land to the African Colonization Society, then they would be annihilated. So they had no choice. Now you can see, so much later on in Liberia's history. By the way, Liberia would get its independence in 1847, and those descendants of African Americans, formerly enslaved African Americans, who decided to resettle, right, in Africa, in Liberia. They're called Liberians. But as people say, I don't know how accurate it is, but many Liberians and many historians insist the constant conflict and friction between the repatriated, resettled African Americans, right, and the indigenous Africans who were there in Liberia, led to the Civil War, which lasted about 14 years, right, from about 1989 to about 2003, right, the devastating, brutal Civil War in Liberia, right. So because apparently the African Americans who were resettled, the former slaves who resettled in Liberia, viewed themselves as superior to the indigenous Africans that were there. So there's something about human beings who we like to create hierarchy, right? We like to create hierarchy. So it wasn't a matter of African Americans, formerly freed African Americans who were resettling in Africa. It wasn't a matter of them just re-assimilating into African society. No, they were basically creating a new hierarchy, new social class structure that they were, and they wanted to put themselves on top of the food chain, and this created conflict, right? This is how historians and Liberians themselves have interpreted it, and it led much later on to a 14-year civil war. So it's been a complex dynamic, and but in any event, I thought I should explain the American Colonization Society, which some of our presidents were involved with, like including President James Monroe, President James Madison, and President Thomas Jefferson, right? So I'll stop this here, and I could do further discussions about the American Colonization Society and attempts to obtain reparations for slavery. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.